We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. Today we have Russell Gmirkin joining us, and we're doing a series on his book, Berossus in Genesis, Manetho in Exodus, and of course, it's such a long title, but let me get us started here. Russell Gmirkin is an author. He's the author of Berossus in Genesis, Manetho in Exodus, Hellenistic Histories in the Date of the Pentateuch, and Plato in the Creation of the Hebrew Bible. He's working on another book. And what is the title of that book? And welcome to MythVision.
The title of that book is Plato's Timaeus and the Biblical Creation Account. That's the short version.
That's what I was going to ask you. I was going to go, yeah, there's more to that. But yeah.
It's dealing with Genesis 1 through 11, which is also the topic today. And it details how the 7 days of creation, that whole sequence is basically taken from Plato's book on the origins of the universe called Timaeus. And also Genesis 2 through 3, where another god called Yahweh is wandering around the garden and doing things. That also comes from Timaeus. So they aren't really two separate creation accounts. It's Timaeus had his divided into two parts also, with the creator of the cosmos and then these dinky little terrestrial gods who created mortal life and things like that. So it's going to be really groundbreaking and fun. And it goes beyond what I wrote in Berossus and Genesis, but I think Berossus and Genesis still holds up.
This will be an interesting show, I think a pivotal point in our, if you will, in this series of videos based on your book, Berossus in Genesis, Manetho, and Exodus, because we're going to get a sneak peek into this upcoming book as well as delve with the existing content you've already created. And we're going to be dealing with the chapter, specifically Berossus in Genesis. So are you interested? I have to ask you guys a question. Are you interested in the dating of the Hebrew Bible? Most scholars believe the Hebrew Bible was constructed hundreds of years before the Septuagint, sometime around Ezra or Josiah, using historiography and historiographical reasoning, and believe it was made up of four sources, J, E, P, and D. This is called the documentary hypothesis. But what if the Hebrew Bible wasn't as old as we suppose? In this series, Russell Gmirkin will give us a case where the Hebrew Bible was developed, so to speak, 5 minutes before the Septuagint Greek translation was written in Alexandria. Could the Hebrew Bible be a Hellenistic work? And are there problems with the documentary hypothesis? We will wrestle with this in Berossus and Genesis, Manetho, and Exodus. How do we begin this? Because there seems to be most people who are critical scholars will say, look, we see that there's a backdrop to the Mesopotamian, the Babylonian myths, and Genesis is using that backdrop. And then we can go from there. So if you would like to comment on that, then we can move forward into details that I think are interesting and notes that I took while reading that we can cover.
Certainly. Well, scholars have noted for a long time that the early chapters just use materials that are Babylonian or Sumerian or from ancient Mesopotamia. There's the flood story. There's the 10 generations before the flood. Some people have said the creation account was based on Enuma Elish. So there's a strong case for Babylonian influence. But the question is, when did these Babylonian sources come to the attention of the authors of the biblical material? Now, the prevailing paradigm has said that the whole Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, are relatively ancient, written during the monarchy and the Babylonian period and the Persian period, basically when Judea was within the ancient Near East, per se. I hold that it was written later after Alexander the Great took over the East, conquered, and so it's a paradox that there's these ancient Babylonian sources used in Genesis, and yet they might date to the Greek Hellenistic period. And the reason why that's possible is because there was an author named Berossus, who was a Babylonian priest in the temple of Marduk, and he wrote around 280 BC. That's just 10 years before the Septuagint translation. And he wrote a book called the Babyloniaca, or, the history of Babylon. And he brought all these cuneiform traditions to the attention of the wider Greek world, including the flood story, creation story. All of this became available in Greek to everyone in the whole Mediterranean world during the Hellenistic era. So you have these Babylonian sources,
right,
but they were published way late after the time of Alexander the Great.
And so this is the dispute in this chapter that you go into, issues that we find and it goes down to some details, like which versions. There's different versions of the flood myths from Mesopotamia, and some date later, like you said. And finding out where they're pulling their source from, the Bible, is going to indicate often what you're suggesting, a dating mechanism in which we could say there's no way, for example, and this is one of the later notes that we get into, there's parts of the Tower of Babel myth that come from something that we know was written by 600. We have no evidence of it before that. So how can we have a 9th and 10th century source claiming that the biblical authors are writing Genesis using this narrative when we know that it's written at 600? So at least it needs to be later than that. And this is the minimalist approach. So that's just one example. We'll actually get into that example as we go on. I think I'll start us off with number one. Ladies and gentlemen, please bear with me because this is such a broad topic. It's difficult for me to I could throw basic questions out there, but I want to give you details that I have excerpts from his book that I'll read. And I'll try to be as quick with brevity so that we can have Russell do the discussing. Only Genesis and Berossus also mention the creation of animals. Enuma Elish omitted this detail. Enuma Elish would be old, very old. An interesting feature of the Genesis account is that all created animal life reproduced after its own kind. This was emphasized in the point of repetition. This may represent a specific polemic against the Mesopotamian tradition that the earliest animals included monsters of a composite nature: man birds, man goats, man horses, man fish, dog horses, and many other amazing creatures that had the appearance of two different animals combined. These composite creatures figured prominently in Berossus, in Enuma Elish, and in the Mesopotamian sculpture. If the Genesis creation of animals reproducing after their kind was a polemic against Mesopotamian literature, this suggests an awareness of Berossus by the author of Genesis 1 to 11. Would you be interested in commenting on this?
I really find these composite creatures, which are kind of like centaurs that are half human and half horse, I find them fascinating.
You should see my waist down, you know.
No, I shouldn't. Please, well,
I'm just teasing.
I don't even want to think about that.
I have horse legs. That's what I'm trying to say.
That's what I hear. The Babylonian creation myths are filled with all sorts of fantastical creatures and half this, half that. Battles between Marduk and Tiamat, who is goddess of chaos. Marduk slew her and used her body to create the heaven and earth. He split it into, propped it up with seashells, and and then we have the universe. So that's the kind of story quality that these Mesopotamian myths have. Berossus kind of toned all that down because he was aiming for a more sophisticated, urbane, cosmopolitan, educated Greek world. He didn't really much these strange and exotic creatures. The creation account resembles Berossus more in that respect. Berossus was kind of halfway between the Babylonians and the Greeks. Now, as far as reproducing after their kind, I have since discovered that this was also a theme in Plato's Timaeus. So there may be a more direct Timaeus link than Berossus, but certainly this does not follow these ancient, exotic Mesopotamian creation myth stories. So I guess that's my comment for the moment.
Interesting. All right. Second comment I'd like to make, and these are excerpts from your book. Some of this stuff is notes for me. You can tell the difference usually. According to Genesis 2:2-3, after the creation of the universe in 6 days, God rested from his labors on the seventh day, the Sabbath. It is widely believed that this Sabbath of the gods was dependent on Mesopotamian traditions. According to the Atrahasis epic, after the universe was created, the gods had to do all the manual work, digging canals and raising crops. The labor of the gods was so excessive that they were ready to revolt until Enki, or Marduk in Enuma Elish, created humans to bear the load of the gods. Once primeval humans were created and the toil of the gods was imposed on them, the gods could be at leisure. In Genesis 2:15, humans were created to tend to God's garden in Eden, in accordance to Mesopotamian ideas. Given Berossus's extensive excerpts from Enuma Elish and his probable knowledge of a flood story related to the Atrahasis epic, it is likely that he also explained the purpose of humanity's creation as giving the gods rest from their labors, in a passage not preserved by Alexander Polyhistor. Anyway, I think it's interesting just to make point that the people who, there's a guy who's I guess a lot of experts say, and you probably know who this is, he butchers the Sumerian and the Akkadian text to make it say that these aliens came to Earth, created humans to dig for gold for them and stuff. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Is this Sitchin? Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
But I don't want to get lost on that.
No, let's not.
Yeah, I just figured I'd say, like, this is real scholarship we're talking about here, and why the gods made humans. The gods used to have to work their butts off, and they were getting sick of it. So they made humans to tend to the earth and the labors of what the gods once did. This sounds just like Adam, tending the Garden of Eden. And so would you comment on this some?
Yeah, there may be some Mesopotamian influence there. Adam evidently didn't have to work very hard, though, because when he was cursed, then he had to go out and toil with the sweat of his brow, and there were thorns that grew up, and agricultural became much more difficult. There is an echo of Mesopotamian myths there. Adam was initially, he was taken from the land of Eden outside the garden. Evidently, the garden itself was a pleasure palace of fruit trees and wonderful things. And outside was where the arable agricultural land was, where they would till the ground. And he was taken from there and put in the garden and tend to the fruit trees and things like that. So, yeah, he was God's worker or subservient, and there's definitely some echoes of Mesopotamia there.
Do you find any Timaeus connections to the Garden of Eden, or not really? Not in that particular source?
Yeah, there's quite a bit, actually. Well, not so much Timaeus.
Okay.
But Timaeus had a sequel. First, there was Timaeus, which was a conversation between Socrates, an Italian cosmographer and astronomer named Timaeus, and another individual named Critias. Well, the whole object of this conversation was Critias wanted to tell this marvelous tale of the continent of Atlantis, and how the ancient Athenians battle with Atlantis and conquered them, and it's this glorious deed in ancient times. So as a prequel, Socrates asked Timaeus, could you cover where the universe came from and the gods? Let's get that out of the way first, and then that'll kind of set the stage for the tale in Critias. So anyway, moving forward to Critias and the story of Atlantis. Well, Atlantis was a paradise with lush trees and temples and streams. It's pretty evident that the description of the Garden of Eden came from Plato's book called Critias.
Yeah, I had a question actually recently where someone asked me, can you ask Dr. Price about connections to Atlantis and Genesis? So you're actually going to be the guy we need to go to about this particular subject matter, and I'll make a hell of a thumbnail for that kind of show. So thank you for answering that. This is my notes, reading about Tiamat and Marduk. I think it's interesting to point out Tiamat equals the moon, Marduk equals the sun. The moon ruled the night and the sun ruled the day. This is a common trope, of course, among different mythologies, Egyptian mythology, various mythologies. However, seeing they have utilized Mesopotamian mythology as a polemic against Mesopotamian mythology, but also invoking their myth to their own creation narrative, I'd like to hear you comment on that, Tiamat and Marduk, with the Mesopotamian connections, but also if you have any added sneak peeks, I'm all ears.
So you have the story of the battle of Tiamat and Marduk. Tiamat was this dragon-like, watery, chaotic creature in primordial times, and Marduk was the new god in town. He decided that he wanted to become the leader of the gods. The council of the gods elected him, and he led this battle against Tiamat. So that was the original creation myth of the Enuma Elish, where Marduk defeated Tiamat and constructed out of her corpse. The idea that Marduk was the sun and Tiamat was a watery darkness, that is kind of an allegorical interpretation that Berossus imposed on the original story. There are some Babylonian references to Marduk as light or the sun or things like that, but he went full on allegory, and he said that when this bizarre creation story says that Marduk slew Tiamat, what that meant was that it's really talking about how the world began in darkness and chaos and water, and how the light came in and defeated the darkness. So he took this myth and turned it into a Greek cosmology. He spruced it up with science by means of his allegorical method. But now what's interesting is, in doing so, he said that the Babylonians had the world start out in darkness and water. Genesis 1 verse 2, which said that the earth was without form and void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. So you have the darkness and the watery oceans in Genesis 1 verse 2. In Berossus, you have Tiamat being water and darkness. But that was not in the original Enuma Elish. So the version that Berossus had is actually closer to Genesis than the cuneiform original. Now this has really messed with scholars, because what does Moses resemble Genesis 1 verse 2 so much? Well, they said, well, there's only one conceivable explanation. This is a Jewish interpolation into Berossus, like Berossus' history of Babylon. And somehow the Jews got a hold of it, and they made some changes here and there. And that's the only version that came down to Alexander Polyhistor, and that's the type we have today. They said it had to have happened that way because we know the Enuma at least didn't have darkness and water. This sounds like Genesis. We know that Genesis is really old. He's way before Berossus. So Berossus must be indirectly utilizing Genesis by means of these Jewish editors, these redactors, which is all a bunch of nonsense. And it's based on the idea that Genesis is this ancient Near Eastern text,
right?
Instead of being written after the time of Berossus, in which case there's no problem. These guys were reading Berossus. They saw darkness and water, and they used it. They went with it. No problem at all. So it's a matter of it's one of the good chronological clues that the Book of Genesis is a lot younger than people imagine. It's younger than 280 BC at the earliest.
So this is an interesting part to mention prior to moving to our next issue. What we have is early church fathers actually point out this very thing, and they say Berossus, they're known for this. So did Josephus, the Jewish apologist, the Christian apologist. Berossus borrowed from Genesis, which then makes Genesis older than Berossus, which is why a lot of this stuff looks like it. Can you make a quick comment on church fathers that might have done this and their reasoning behind it?
Yeah, and it's any time that the Bible resembled other documents, whether Manetho or Berossus or Plato. Well, Moses, he wrote the first 5 books of Moses in 1450 BC. And that's older than Plato and Manetho and Berossus and all the rest, according to Josephus and the church fathers and everyone who bought into the kind of fundamentalist reading of the Bible that everyone adopted back then. So clearly, Berossus must have copied from Genesis if there are passages in the two that are so closely related. And that's something very common. You see that argument used over and over again. Nobody back then imagined that the biblical books were as young as they were. They accepted biblical claims about the authors and dates of the biblical texts. And this wasn't just the Jews. This was Greeks and Romans, pagans. Everybody just kind of bought into the idea that the Bible, and especially the books of Moses, were really ancient. And they made their inferences from there. But now we finally know better. We know that Genesis was a young book. The Pentateuch borrowed on all sorts of older Greek and Babylonian and Egyptian texts.
Mm.
So it's a new paradigm. It's a new way of looking at things.
Okay. Can you comment? And by the way, while I'm doing this, I'm actually trying to kind of educate people who may not know this stuff that well. I know I didn't. And even reading your book, I learned so much. So I had picked up on this, the Garden of Eden you wrote, and this is a note, of course, you cover a lot more on this in your book, being a polemic against the Sumerian flood story, arts of civilization idea. Can you go into detail of what's going on here with the teaching the arts and the Apkallu, the sages, and what's going on, the polemic that's being here, if you will, between these two accounts, or more than two accounts, if it depends on where you want to say they got their sources. And also, is there any connection to the Greeks in this?
Yes, both the Greeks and the Mesopotamians had their own, I guess you could say, competing stories about the origins of human knowledge, inventions of all types. In the Greek world, the most famous is that of Prometheus. Prometheus was a titan. He was one of the gods. Humans were so miserable, naked, pathetic creatures, living in caves, defenseless. So he had pity on these poor humans, and he stole fire from Zeus and gave it to the humans. He arts of slings, building, and fabrics, and all the arts of civilization came from Prometheus. And as a reward, Zeus had him crucified, nailed, or chained to the rocks of Mount Caucasus for about 1,000 years because he didn't want humans getting a hold of divine knowledge. And he took it quite personally. Now, in the Babylonian world, 7 creatures called Apkallu, who were half human and half fish. There's lots of pictures of them, statues and inscriptions. The upper half of their body is human, and they have kind of a fish head on top. And then the lower part is a fish with scales and fins, and it's one of those composite creatures we're talking about. They taught humanity all the arts of civilization because very similar to the Greeks, humans were helpless without this divine knowledge. And the first one, first off, these 7 Apkallu, a lot of people have compared them to the first 7 generations in Genesis that ended with Enoch, the 7th, who has been compared to the last 7 famous Apkallu. But the first of these Apkallu was named Oannes in Berossus, Oanadapa in other sources. And he is the one who taught the very first humans about kingship and building cities and all sorts of technology. And in a lot of ways, this creature, this Apkallu, sent from above, he very much resembles the serpent in Genesis, who brings knowledge to humans. And I talked about that a bit in my chapter on Berossus here.
I have, let me read you some. I hope your voice holds out. It always does this. It's like the curse of Lambert.
Me too, every time. It is.
It is such a curse. In fact, we're in the Genesis narrative. Obviously, it's a curse right now. He's laboring to keep his voice. So Adam and Eve, goddess, courtesan, if you will, and Enkidu. I want to read something from his book for everybody that I find interesting, and then maybe you make a comment and we'll keep moving, because there's a lot of stuff that is just so fascinating people should read, even if they don't, let's say, conclude your dating, even though that's your purpose. If you haven't read these stories or you don't know about these parallels, this is an absolutely wonderful book to do this. So the parallels between Enkidu and Adam, the courtesan and Eve. Am I saying that right, courtesan?
Yeah.
Okay. They have long been noted. The subsequent adventures of Gilgamesh and Enkidu slaying the monster Humbaba, guardian of the forest of Lebanon, the great bull of heaven, and the lions of the other wild animals as well, eventually migrated to the Greek world as the labors of Hercules. Gilgamesh and Enkidu soon became a nuisance to the gods by killing their monsters, chopping down the gods' cedars in Lebanon, and so forth. Here we have a probable parallel in Genesis 6, 2-5, which speaks of the sons of God cohabiting with the daughters of men and the troublesome violence of their gigantic offspring. It was therefore decreed that one of them should die, despite their being offspring of the gods. The gods chose between Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Enkidu fell tragically ill and died. The sequel closely parallels the story of Cain and Abel. Gilgamesh was so saddened by the death of his brother Enkidu and distraught at the idea of his own mortality, he became a wanderer, walking from land to land, clad in his lion's skin, like Hercules, in exile from Thebes. In one passage of the Gilgamesh epic, a barmaid locked the doors to keep Gilgamesh out, fearing from his strange appearance and expression that he was a murderer. It is conceivable that in some earlier version of the story, Gilgamesh slew Enkidu, and for this reason went into exile. All this was echoed in the biblical account of Cain's wandering from the murder of Abel. At the second, that's so powerful, by the way. At the end of his wanderings in the east, Gilgamesh reached the waters at the ends of the world, the Persian Gulf, and commissioned a boat to take him to the island of paradise at the mouth of the rivers to seek out the secret of immortality. There, Gilgamesh found Utnapishtim and his wife, the heroes of the flood, living in paradise, immortal. They told him the story of the deluge, the flood, and their survival in the ark, and their later translation to paradise. They promised to share with him the secret of immortality if he could stay awake for 7 days. But notice the 7 here again. But Gilgamesh fell into a deep sleep, failing the test. So Gilgamesh was sent away from paradise, but first was given the plant of life, which if he ate, would give him immortality. But before he had a chance to consume it, a snake slithered in and ate the plant of life, stealing the gift of immortality. The ancients believed that snakes were immortal, reborn each time they shed their skin. That was an interesting note I put in there. So Gilgamesh was forever barred from paradise and lost his chance to live forever. The parallels with the story of the Garden of Eden, the Tree of Life, and the expulsion from paradise are well known. Care to comment?
Well, I love studying literatures from different societies. These were some really fascinating comparisons with Mesopotamian myths. And I do the same with the Greeks. I've done the same with the Egyptians. There's not there. Most of the biblical material seem to come from Mesopotamia or from Greece. Yeah, I think that some of this plot came from the Gilgamesh epic, the rivalries between Gilgamesh and Enkidu. There were actually other traditions that seem to show that the whole line from Adam down to Noah may have been giant, may have been semi-divine creatures. That's in the pseudepigrapha, and so we won't really get into that. That's a book down the line from me, where I deal with some of the Enoch tradition. Take a look at Genesis 1 through 11 from that perspective. It's really important to examine all the comparative data from all the potentially influencing civilizations on the biblical text, not to assume that it's only Mesopotamian or that it's only really ancient. It's really a detective story. Yeah, my analysis with Cain and Abel, that was fun to research. I think I noticed a few things that no one else have. It hasn't really been picked up by the literature, but I'm glad that you enjoyed it.
I always enjoy that kind of stuff, like finding out, like, is there a source previous? Like we're going to get into the Tower of Babel. I was shocked to even hear the poem that you describe in there. I've asked plenty of scholars that I've interviewed so far, and they just don't know where that might have like the potential origin for such a tradition. But we're going to get into that. Let's talk about the serpent, the slippery little sneaky guy who's equated with the devil in Christian lore. However, the serpent in its origin, just like Berossus looking at his origin myths of the Mesopotamians, the Sumerians, if you will, he allegorizes a lot of things. So we're trying to get to the source of where maybe the polemics are coming from and what's the point here. So the serpent, a very interesting example of polemics in Genesis, not previously noted by those investigating Mesopotamian influences on Genesis 1 through 11, that's chapters 1 through 11, was the transformation of the Apkallu Oannes. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Oannes, or
right, Oannes, yeah.
Oannes,
Oanadop, all sorts of, yeah.
Okay. Of the Apkallu Oannes into the serpent of the Garden of Eden. The serpent of Genesis 3 was very unusual, an unusual creature. The serpent had the capability of speech, carried on conversations with humans. He was the wisest of all the animals and the agent by which primitive humans acquired the knowledge of the gods. Apparently, the serpent initially had legs and could walk. For at Genesis 3:14, God's curse on the serpent was that he would henceforth crawl on his belly in the dust. The parallels with the Apkallu Oannes are evident. Oannes, who was half human and half fish, could, like the serpent of Genesis, walk and speak. So would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, there were Oannes, the half fish, half human, is an interesting character. After I wrote Berossus and Genesis, though, I noted another interesting parallel to Babylonia and Assyria. There's a creature that's depicted all over the front gates and walls of the palace at Nineveh, I believe. And it is half dragon, sort of serpent, and it's got horns, and it has legs. It's kind of a walking serpent. It's possible that that imagery may have also influenced the biblical account. There's also a little bit of an echo of Timaeus, though, Plato's Timaeus, when he described serpents as the lowest of all creatures because they didn't have legs and they had to wiggle on the ground. So in Plato's myth, he said that if you're a human and you were really, really good, then your soul could go up into the earth. But if you were bad, then you would be reincarnated in another life form, a lower life form such as women. He was a bit of a misogynist. Or else a little bit below that were birds or animals with legs, or fishes they didn't even have legs, they were down in the water. Clams were below them, but really the lowest were these serpents because they didn't have any legs. You could get demoted to being one of these legless serpents in Plato's scheme. So there could be an echo of Plato there also.
Interesting.
Especially since he also talked about eating the fruit of the tree as a sexual metaphor. So there's a couple specific echoes in Genesis 2 through 3 from Plato's Timaeus.
That's very interesting you say that. I want to rabbit trail off my notes here because I think it's always more it's more unique whenever sometimes I just go with what I feel and not just notes. In the older Mesopotamian literature, it's clearly indicating sexual knowledge that is making them wise. However, it doesn't equate it with eating of a fruit. It doesn't say that, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong. So this is where Timaeus or a Greek source would find its way in, mingling with an older Mesopotamian source, correct?
Yes. So probably what you have in the writing of Genesis 1 through 11, which is a kind of a sub-document within Genesis, you have some people who are educated in the Greek classics. They're educated in Plato, but they may have been Babylonians who were writing this material. Now, when I say they were Babylonians, that's going to maybe shock some of the viewers because everyone says, well, the authors of the books of Moses were Jewish, right? Well, first off, not necessarily, because the books of Moses talk about 12 tribes of Israel. 10 of them are from northern Israel, what we would call Samaria, and only one of them was Judah, the Jews. So there's a lot of evidence that the Samaritans had a large role in writing the books of Moses. Add to that the fact that in around 720 BC, Samaria was conquered by the Assyrians, became an Assyrian province, and they deported all the educated ruling elites out of Samaria, and they brought in a bunch of rebellious Babylonians in their place. So Samaria became a Babylonian colony. And these were educated ruling elites. They were the smartest ruling class people brought into this Assyrian province. Well, what happened to them? Did they just disappear? Did they evaporate? You know, scholars say, well, they integrated with the local Israelites and disappeared from here. No, they didn't. Every educated group, every ruling group in history, they try and preserve themselves, preserve their traditions, because that's what gives them the edge, the power. So you have this Babylonian community or stratum of Samaritan elites who persisted clear down through the Babylonian period, the Persian period, and into the Hellenistic period. And these were the smartest people. They were the most literate people, and they helped write the books of Moses, among other parts of the Bible. So that's why you have this really incredible Babylonian outlook to Genesis. Not only in these first 11 chapters, where you have lots of Babylonian myths, and where the authors loved the Babylonica of Berossus. That was like the favorite book. But then you later have Abraham, who comes from Babylonia. Really? Yeah. The ancestors of the Jews didn't come from Judea. They didn't come from the land of Israel or Canaan. They came from Babylonia. Why would you say that if your people had lived there forever? Well, these were actual Babylonians. They did come from Babylon. They came and colonized parts of the area, and they wrote their national history into the book of Genesis. So that's why you get a lot of this Babylonian material in Genesis, and that's kind of a new paradigm for who are these biblical authors. You know, first off, not necessarily Jews. A lot of it probably Samaritan, and when you're talking Samaritan, you're talking Babylonian.
Ooh. This is good. This is good because we're gonna get into something you mentioned in this chapter about this and someone who's written on this topic. So the Sumerian, let's detour for a second, and we're coming back in a sense as we jab into new material that you discussed in this chapter. Sumerian Kings List. Genesis 5, 3 through 32 listed 10 generations of patriarchs before the flood, ending with Noah. The pre-deluge generations before the flood were extraordinary long-lived, suggesting comparison with the 10 kings before the flood in Berossus. Now, the interesting thing you mentioned, and I guess it'll be important to jab at, most people don't realize that in the 10 king list of Berossus, which is a later, he is, once again, we're talking a Babylonian priest who's translating the Akkadian, potentially other Sumerian languages into the Greek language. He lists 10 kings, and what we have is 10 patriarchs in the Bible. But the older versions of this don't necessarily have 10 kings. There's 9 and there's 8 and there's different numbers that don't really come to this 10 thing, which kind of indicates, is Berossus the source? Can you explain the kings list connection to Berossus and not the older Sumerian list just briefly?
10 kings in Berossus before the flood, who they lived tens of thousands of years long. They were really, really long-lived.
That's historically accurate, right? No, I'm just kidding.
That is, it's in a cuneiform document that's practically contemporary. Is better documented than other documents I could talk about. So, yeah. So they've noted the striking resemblance, and they noted that from Berossus before they started to find the originals behind Berossus, this Sumerian king list. Now, this is Sumeria with a U. It's not Sumeria, the Northern Kingdom, just for the viewers. Sumer is where civilization began. It was in existence before Babylonia, before Assyria. They had their own language. They had all sorts of traditions. And they had this tradition about how there were 10 kings before the flood. And they were really, they lived a long time. So biblical scholars said, wow, that same tradition here. But then the cuneiform originals started showing up, and there were only 7 kings. No, there were 8. No, there were 9. You know, it's only when you come down to Berossus that there's 10. Mm-hmm. So it could be a little bit earlier than that because he was working with some sort of source. But the other one, 600 or 700 BC, I believe, they had the wrong number of kings. Now, there's another striking parallel. The 7th of these 10 kings was a king named Enmerderanki. And he was a very special individual because he got to heaven, basically. He went before the gods in heaven, and they gave him divine wisdom. He became the first diviner. He was instructed by some of those Akalu that we were talking about. A lot of the Assyrian and Babylonian wisdom literature, scholarly literature, they say traces back to this number 7 guy, Enmerderanki. Well, he's in the exact same position as Enoch in the 7 out of 10 patriarchs before the flood. And you'll recall Enoch also was related to the presence of God. He walked with God. In the pseudepigrapha especially, they talk about him receiving all these divine secrets and traditions. Mm-hmm. The Enoch literature is to him, all sorts of prophecies. So you have number 7 was this wise figure who went to the gods. And so that's a very, very striking parallel that's in Berossus. He's not number 7 in some of those earlier lists. So all of this shows that, yeah, it's a very ancient tradition. The Sumerian king list. It's not even written in Akkadian. It's written in Sumerian. So where did the Jews or Samaritans get a hold of this esoteric cuneiform text that was only found in temple libraries guarded by Babylonian priests? Where did they get it? How did they learn how to read cuneiform? And okay, fine, they can read cuneiform, they can read Akkadian, fine, we'll give them that ridiculousness. How did they learn Sumerian exactly, which was a dead language that had not been spoken for 1,000 years, and that only the super scholarly Babylonians, educated elites, knew how to read that? You know, just exactly how did these Jews get a hold of this strange ancient text in a dead language and decide, hey, I'm going to copy that into my version of Genesis? It doesn't make any sense. But what does make sense is it got translated into Greek. It's in this Greek book, Berossus, in 280 BC. Everybody read Greek then. Certainly all the ruling class people did. You speak Greek with the Ptolemies or the Seleucids or whoever is ruling Judea or Samaria at the time. So it was very accessible. It was written in Greek, and that's where they got it from. That's part of the argument I have in my Berossus book.
Let me take a devil's advocate jab to see what you have to say. From what I understand, Babylonia obviously conquered and ruled the Jews, which is Israel, if you will. And I don't mean it in the strange northern kingdom sense, so to speak, but regardless, we know they conquered Judea at least. Do you think it's and when did that happen? We're talking 600 BC. Say that again.
586 BC. 586 is when Nebuchadnezzar actually conquered Judea twice, but in 586 is when he destroyed the temple and took the royal family and priests captive, and that was the definitive end of the kingdom of Judah. So that's when it happened.
Wouldn't it be fair to say that the best explanation for dating this particular myth, Genesis myth story, no earlier than the conquering of Babylon and no later than the date that you actually put? So the people who are saying 9th, 10th century BC, it's like, wouldn't it be more common sense to say, look, all right, we know that the Babylonians at least conquered Judea. And if you want to say that they mingled with the scribes and learned some of their lore, and they came to some common ground of learning each other's language or something, it at least needed to happen after 586. Would you say?
One would think. There is also the theory, way before there was a Judah or an Israel as kingdoms, the Babylonians had conquered part of that region when 1400s BC, a long time ago. So they conquered part of Canaan. So maybe the Canaanites got a hold of the Gilgamesh epic, and for some reason they liked the Sumerian king list, and they got all these documents. And we don't have any evidence of this, but maybe they had this collection of Babylonian traditions. So they passed it down, and eventually the Jews got them, or Judeans got them from the local Canaanites.
That's what I was going to say.
There's so many steps in between. And the thing is, they've looked at all these Babylonian, Mesopotamian traditions, and there's not a shadow of a hint of Canaanite influence on any of them. You don't find any Canaanite rulers or there's no trace. It's just pure, undiluted Mesopotamian traditions. So I point that out in my book, that's just not viable. But then the alternative is, after 586 BC, they were conquered by the Babylonians. They went into captivity, and then they decided, we're going to take all of these Babylonian traditions and write them into our Bible. For instance, they're going to decide. The same explanation was given to the laws of Hammurabi and why they're in the Pentateuch, and other such things that somehow they were exposed to them. That Hammurabi was around 1500 BC. Somehow they were exposed to them and preserved all this time, and eventually written into the Pentateuch. That doesn't work either. So now there's the theory that when they went into captivity, they come up with the laws of Hammurabi. They come on all these Babylonian traditions, and they said, listen, we're going to write down the laws of Moses. Let's use some of these laws of Hammurabi and pass them off as Moses. And nobody will know the difference. There's just no evidence that the people in the Babylonian exile were literate. They were scholars. They were writing literature. They had access to all these esoteric Babylonian traditions and law collections. They have documents from the Babylonian exile in Babylon, and the people there were not producing literature. They were polytheistic. They were worshiping Babylonian gods alongside with Yahweh. You can tell that by their names. They were just grunts. They were working their farms, and they were so not a scribal culture that when they had legal documents, they would have a Babylonian write them up for them. They didn't even have their own scribes for their marriage certificates or financial transactions. So, it's just been this hypothesis that the Jews got a hold of Babylonian traditions, either, way over 1,000 years BC, before the time of David and Solomon, or else during captivity, they took on all these Babylonian traditions and they said, okay, we're going to rewrite Genesis. We're going to say that, right now we're in exile from Judea. We're living in Babylon. Well, we're going to say that our ancestors were actually in exile from Babylon, which is where we're living now, and they colonized Judea. I mean, it's
yeah, you
a
can
bunch
see
of
where
scholarly hypothesis.
I want everybody to kind of see the tension. Of course, this is the kind of pokes that the scholars are doing at the minimalist approach that Russell's bringing up here. And this is just why I asked, because I knew you would give this explanation. Let's move forward. What are some of the weak points of dating the parallels to the Gilgamesh Flood Stories compared to Berossus? What parallels are there between the flood myths and the Gilgamesh Epic Tablet 11? So I guess if I could read this little excerpt, I think this kind of applies to it. Certain features are common to both the Gilgamesh epic and Berossus, but lacking in Genesis. The flood hero was warned in a dream. Friends or craftsmen were brought aboard the ark along with provisions. The flood lasted only briefly. The flood hero was translated into the company of the gods. And this is interesting. A detail better paralleled in Genesis by Enoch than by Noah. So in the Gilgamesh epic, you have someone's translated to the company of the gods, which Enoch does, not Noah. Such details are not useful in determining whether Genesis 6-9 bears a closer relationship to Berossus or the Gilgamesh Epic Tablet 11. The same comment applies to other features, which are different in all three accounts. The dimensions of the ark, the name of the Armenian mountain on which the ark rested, and the name of the flood hero. How would you handle that? Or if you will, can you comment on what we just discussed there?
Sure. Well, for one thing, since I wrote Berossus and Genesis, they've discovered a new fragment of the Gilgamesh epic that describes the ark as round. It was a round boat, kind of like the round reed boats that have been used on the Euphrates River. It's a type of boat they have there. So there's another difference. There's the Mesopotamian aspects that some of them are very strikingly the same. For instance, releasing ravens at the end of and doves at the end of the story to see if the waters had receded. That's very striking. It shows that there is some kind of a dependence. On the other hand, the reason for the flood is strikingly different. In the Gilgamesh epic or in the different Mesopotamian flood stories, it's the noisy neighbors, that humans were making so much noise down there. First, they created humans so they could do all the work. And now they're making so much noise that the gods can't rest like they wanted. They can't sleep because of those party people, next door. Well, next door is actually below heaven or whatever. So they're like, we gotta do something about this. We can't call the cops. I know what. We'll send a flood and wipe everybody out. So that was the reason that they gave, which is a bit different. In the Bible, it's a matter of ethics. The humans became progressively more violent and wicked, and their imaginations turned to wickedness all the time. The only ancient parallel to that is Plato it's the story of Atlantis, where because these Atlanteans, the royal family of Atlantis, they started out righteous because they were marrying the gods, right? I mean, the god Poseidon knocked up this beautiful girl in his land, and she had 5 pairs of twins. 2 of them were Atlas, and I forget the other one. Anyway, Atlas was the eldest, so he was obviously a giant, like in Book of Genesis. And they started out because they were half gods. Their rule was righteous, but they kept on intermarrying with these humans. All these human women were evidently irresistible. So generation by generation, you start out being half god, and then you're 1/4 god, and then you're 1/8. And down the line, they were just like regular humans. So of course they were violent and ambitious and greedy and unrighteous, you could say. And they planned to invade the Mediterranean and conquer Greece and all the civilized world, which was a bad, wicked thing. So Zeus decided we have to punish these people for their own good and take this righteous race and set it back on the right track. And so he sent rain, floods, earthquake that sank Atlantis and much of the world. And so in Plato, it turns into this big ethical story about a just God who has to wipe out most of humanity because of some wicked doings. So that is the striking parallel, where part of there's this Greek Platonic tradition that kind of gets overlaid onto this Babylonian story. And you've got a little mix there. But I hadn't read Critias and Plato at the time I wrote Berossus, so I only had kind of half the picture.
It's interesting too that you noting these similarities, even in the older myths that the Greeks are using here, especially Plato. And I say Greeks as in like Berossus is also using these older myths and stuff. So it's not like a single guy doing one thing. But what I noticed is, if I'm not mistaken, Gilgamesh is 2/3 God, or he is like
Yes.
2/3 a god. And so like there is this idea that like you will, if you mix anymore, you're going to start becoming less divine. And just a common note that I took was these older narratives actually allow for the gods to die. Later mythologies kind of have like an immortality. The Mesopotamian gods can actually perish, like Tiamat being destroyed to create the earth. We have the same thing with Leviathan, I think, in the biblical narrative is a god dragon type figure similar to Tiamat, being destroyed to create the world and whatnot. Anyway, moving on. That was well said, though. And I love hearing about Atlantis and the Greek source and Zeus. And I love how you just kind of bring in multiple things, because that's the shocking new information you're not going to hear anywhere else, and only coming from you sourcing this. And it's going to be in your book. How does the source, and this is where we're getting into interesting ground here on the Tower of Babel, like I said at the beginning, that not many scholars know or talk about this, but how does the source of the Tower of Babel change the dating game for the Genesis account? For example, Nabopolassar and the older Esagila, I think I'm saying that right, or Esagila. Can you explain the difference there and why there's a dating issue? Why you believe the dating puts it later, so to speak?
Yes. Well, there's a story. First off, the Tower of Babel was a ziggurat, which is a 7-tiered building in Babylon that housed the temple of the gods. You ascended up these levels. It was kind of like ascending to heaven. Everyone recognizes that this is a Babylonian architectural model, and that that this is some kind of weird Babylonian tradition. No scholar has said this is where they got it from. But I pointed out in my book that this story of the Tower of Babel and being destroyed, that it probably came from a poem called the Poem of Era, which was very entertaining.
I was going to ask you too if I could read that, or do you want to read it? It's up
go
to
ahead.
you.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, because this is so powerful. I mean, this is what blew my mind, ladies and gentlemen, on a parallel to the Tower of Babel. I have never heard anyone say, oh, it's this, oh, it's that. And like definitive, even scholars have said, like Dr. Price says, look, I'm not sure where the parallel is. I think this is it. And Russell has this here, particularly in the book. The Poem of Era. The Mesopotamian source of the Tower of Babel story appears to have been the Poem of Era, which described both the flood and later destruction of Babylon in a second catastrophe of comparable severity. The Poem of Era was a very popular work, enjoying even a wider circulation in the first millennium BCE than the Gilgamesh epic. According to this poem, the flood occurred when Marduk, lord of the gods, was angered at humankind and rose from his royal throne. A cosmic catastrophe ensued, affecting both heaven and earth, and floodwaters destroyed most of the humankind as well as the city of Babylon. Marduk himself was drenched, and his royal attire darkened and ruined. Marduk built his house, i.e. his temple at Babylon, and returned to his temple throne, but his government was inadequate due to the condition of his royal garments. The Apkallu sages, who alone were competent to create a new splendid idol of Marduk for the temple, had been sent to the underworld. Marduk therefore planned to leave his throne again to descend to the underworld to have his royal attire restored. Despite the second catastrophe that would inevitably ensue, in his absence, the world would be ruled by Era, the Mesopotamian god of destruction. Waters again would rise, a storm would blot out the sky, and the evil wind would blow. The remnant of humankind who survived the first flood would be threatened with extinction. Cities would be destroyed and temples laid waste. Babylon would fall, as well as other Babylonian cities, even Sippar, I think I'm saying that right, which alone had been spared from the earlier deluge. The ziggurat of the sanctuary of Babylon, the city walls and towers would all be destroyed. But finally, the wrath of Era would be placated. Marduk would be allowed to return to his temple, which, however, Era still presided over. The gods would be reconciled and return to their proper places, and order would be restored. Babylonia would rise again, and Babylon would be rebuilt. Although at the direction of a curiously benevolent Era, god of destruction, not Marduk, as one would expect. The ruined temples would again raise their heads as high as the flaming sun. So, I
couldn't have said that better myself.
Yeah, well, look, I just wanted to read it because it was so hair-standing just hearing it. How much connection that is with this whole flood creation. And this is just something that is so common sense to me. Let me see if I had this on my notes so I don't repeat it. Okay, yeah. Also, the fact that Mesopotamian stories permit gods to be slain, right? We mentioned that. But the fact that the biblical narrative literally has the first city that's being created after the flood is a Babylonian one. We have a ziggurat. We have, like, what the heck is going on? Like, why? Why is Babylon the first city being built? And this ties in with Nimrod. I'd like to get your thoughts, and I wonder if you have any updated new little sneak peeks about this guy named Nimrod, this mighty warrior. Can you connect us to this Babylonian city, the ziggurat, the flood narrative, Nimrod, the mighty warrior? What's going on, man?
Well, there's you just asked a whole lot of questions all at once.
I know.
Well, first off, let me focus on the dating of the Poem of Era. I think I briefly allude to it in my Berossus book, which is
the Samaritan, Pseudo-Eupolemus, a Samaritan author circa 250 BCE, I think, right? Or am I mistaken there?
Yeah, that he provides some additional details, such as the wind blowing down the Tower of Babel. That's not in the biblical story, but it's another point of contact with the poem of Era, which had this wind come and blow down the ziggurat and cause all sorts of devastation on the city of Babylon after the flood. Pseudo-Eupolemus is a very good witness to the fact that this Tower of Babel story comes from the poem of Era. And there's a lot of other indications that Pseudo-Eupolemus was utilizing Berossus for that story. The poem of Era has not survived in surviving fragments of Berossus, but we can use an indirect argument via Pseudo-Eupolemus that, yeah, Berossus did have that story. The other thing is, what is the date of the poem of Era? I argued very briefly the poem of Era was written in the 600s BC, that it reflected historical conditions because Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, had conquered Babylon, the city of Babylon, as well as Babylonia. He had diverted flood waters through the city that devastated it. It ruined many of the temples. He kidnapped many of the statuary. It was an epic catastrophe on the same order as the poem of Era. His son, Esarhaddon, later decided to reconcile the Babylonians. He went back in the early 600s and he restored the temples, he rebuilt, he restored the statues. It was a restoration very much like in the poem of Era, where the city has a happy ending. So I dated the whole story to around, the first decades of the 600s BC. Previously, scholars had dated it to like 1000 BC. But after I wrote Berossus and Genesis, there was another Mesopotamian expert, a scholar, who independently dated the poem of Era to the same context that I did. So,
wow.
Yeah, I was going to publish that as a standalone article in Iraq, one of those journals, but she beat me to it. So thankfully, that's one less thing I have to write. But that shows that this Tower of Babel story has to be, 680 BC or later. It's not as early as biblical scholars had proposed under the documentary hypothesis. So that was an important clue in terms of dating. So I think that covers the poem of Era, unless you have follow-up questions. But then we were going to turn to Nimrod.
Yeah, I want to deal with Nimrod. I just wanted to make mention for everybody. We were talking about Samaritans earlier, potentially being Babylonians. Check this guy out, right? He mentioned Pseudo-Eupolemus. I just say Eupolemus because it seems to...
Yeah.
He's a Samaritan writing in 250 BC. So this is a Samaritan who's connecting Abraham to the giants. How did the Samaritan get these sources in Greek? Well, that's his whole point about Berossus. That is interesting because Berossus was translating these stuff from dead languages into Greek. And of course, this is also a very esoteric form. I mean, the Greeks were big on that, especially by the time you get into Hellenistic area of time. They're Hellenizing, or not Hellenizing, they're esotericizing, if I could use that word. I don't even know if that is one, but they're making everything into like a allegory. We don't like Zeus having sex with women on Earth. Let's make that an allegory. He's not immoral. Let's make that an allegory. Let's make that and I think that's why we see these things happening over and over. But anyway, Nimrod, my nickname, Nimrod, not because I'm a mighty warrior, but because I'm a knucklehead. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Yes. So I also have a section discussing Nimrod and comparing him to Ninus, who was the founder of the book of the city of Nineveh. Ninus didn't really exist. He was invented as an eponymous founder of Nineveh. They decided, who built Nineveh? Well, we'll make a guy named Ninus, and he named the city after himself. So there's a few parallels between Ninus and Nimrod, and I go into that, and I bring in. Go ahead.
I was going to say, maybe it's worth mentioning that there's a guy that's Berossus is challenging his historical count of Mesopotamian history.
Yes.
Ctesias. Yeah, and it's interesting to say that, because there's like one guy's trying to say, can you tell him like what Ctesias is trying to say and what Berossus is trying to do? It's kind of like the Jewish authors arguing against, like just Josephus is trying to argue against Romans or whoever, like there's this issue going on. And it just sounds like an older version of a polemic going back and forth on who's dating and whose history is correct. And so what's going on between these two guys? And maybe Nimrod plays a part in some sense.
Well, Ctesias, he had a lot of fantastic stories. He was kind of, he was a historian, but he was really a gossip. And he would tell these sensational, oftentimes lurid stories of the Assyrian rulers and their different dalliances, and also, he's really a romancer, and people don't give him very much respect. So, but he basically came up with, or at least popularized, the story of Ninus and Semiramis, who was a legendary queen, at least as in terms of how Ctesias presented her, and how this Ninus figure, this Assyrian, founded the city of Babylon along with Semiramis. So Berossus didn't like that, because Berossus was a Babylonian. He was promoting Babylon at every turn. There's a lot of parallels between Nimrod and Ninus. Nimrod is kind of a replacement for Ninus, and in the story in Berossus and in the Bible, Nimrod, who is a Babylonian, he founds Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. So that Berossus is saying that the Babylonians founded Assyria. The Assyrians did not found Babylonia or the city of Babylon. And so there is a polemic going back and forth. And I kind of bring some of that out.
So historically speaking, what's the reality? Babylon founded Assyria or vice versa?
Babylon was extremely ancient. It was its own kingdom. Assyria rose independently, and eventually Assyria conquered Babylonia. And it would rule it for a while, and then it wouldn't rule it, and then it would rule it, and then it would rebel, and went back and forth for a while until finally the Babylonians completely overthrew Assyria. And it was the end of the Assyrian Empire. And the Babylonians became the new world kingdom.
Okay. So one more comment on this, and then I'll let you take it, because this is in the vein of what we're talking about with Nimrod. You say in your book, Gilgamesh has always been a favorite candidate for the prototype of the figure of Nimrod. Like Nimrod, Gilgamesh was a Gibber, or mighty hero. the product of a union of gods and the daughters of men, as in the account of the origin of the giants at Genesis 6:4. Gilgamesh's exploits included chasing down the wild ass of the open country and the panther of the steeps, I think, or steeps, as well as slaying the bull of heaven, lions, and various other monsters. In sills and palace reliefs, he was often seen locked in combat against lions and other creatures. Most striking, Genesis 10:10, Nimrod's kingdom was said to have begun at Babylon and Erech. Erech, Nimrod's second most important foundation, was identical with Uruk, the city ruled by Gilgamesh.
Yes, so there's a lot of echoes of Gilgamesh in the story of Nimrod. They were both mighty hunters. They're both associated with Babylon. They're both associated with the post-flood world as well. Gilgamesh was in the third generation after the deluge, and we already talked about how in the travels of Gilgamesh he visited Utnapishtim, the flood hero, and that's why the flood story is in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So Gilgamesh was in the third generation after the flood, and according to Berossus, he apparently ruled Babylon rather than Uruk. So this is a pro-Babylonian tradition found specifically in Berossus. And that really connects up with the story of Nimrod in a special way, because Babylon is the focus of that biblical tale. So I think Gilgamesh was like the specific prototype for Nimrod in the biblical story.
Whenever you hear him say the word Berossus, start equating that to 280 BCE pretty much. I mean, what I'm saying is late in the game. So when this is the whole point, what Russell's trying to date these books is later, but also I'm sure everyone's had a fantastic, view into the parallels here. So on that, the final note I have in that same vein there, are there any Greek, Atlantean, Plato connections in the Genesis 11 story, which the next episode we're going to get into the Table of Nations, of course, but I ask, like in the Tower of Babel post-flood situation, Nimrod, does he play any role, or this fictional narrative, does this have any role in the Greek world?
Not that I've been able to find. So it seems to be Mesopotamian, but within this Greek book written by a Babylonian in 278 or 280 BC. So it's a Mesopotamian connection in the Greek era, in the Hellenistic era. And I don't see much direct influence from Greek stories on that one.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Russell. I'm going to spare your voice so that next time we do this, it's still working. When is your book going to be released? The latest and the greatest?
Well, Routledge, in my contract with them, they said they want the finished manuscript by October, but I'm hoping to get a final draft at the end of this month or early June. Routledge had some reviewers that had some very good comments. I did additional research, had to rewrite 3 chapters, and I'm working on my final chapter now. So I'm hoping that it'll be to them by early summer. Hopefully their people with the COVID crisis are going to be able to work from home and edit it to their satisfaction. And boy, I would love if it got published this fall. And it's not only has these insights into Genesis 1 through 3 and the flood story and all of that, but it also shows where the Jews got monotheism.
Hmm.
And it wasn't from the Persians, it was specifically from Plato. So that's kind of a major new theory that the book will be presenting. Kind of track down that mystery.
Yeah,
and
that's going to be, ooh. You're asking for trouble now. You're asking for trouble, Russell. Well, I really do appreciate you. I look forward to seeing your book. I always enjoy what you have to bring to the table and interesting connections. Let's do this again. Everybody, try and get the book. I know it's expensive. Have they figured out on ways to lower the price, or there's ways that people can get the book, this Berossus and Genesis, Manetho and Exodus, with the price being so high?
Well, you can look for deals on eBay, but I would recommend, well, first off, I would recommend just go to your library. They won't have it unless your library is a university library, but use interlibrary loan. Say, I want this book, and they'll get it for you no matter where you live. They always do. So you can read it for free, or what I do a lot is I'll get a book from interlibrary loan, I'll target my favorite parts, and I'll photocopy it, which is better than paying $146 or however much it is in hardback from the publisher. But yeah, use your local library. That's
Thank
what
you
I
for
do.
that advice. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, what do you think of this? I really think this is a fun discussion and peering into this ancient languages and ancient context that we find. I mean, you got the Sumerian, you've got the Akkadian, you've got these various languages, and somehow the narratives just go straight into a Canaanite or an ancient Hebrew. I mean, it's tough. This is tough to say that this happened without any evidence. So the minimalist approach is, what can we know? What can we at least put our fingers on and test? Sure, this might not be the case, but the best case we have with the evidence that we have is what Russell's trying to present. And I appreciate that. I really do, because you're starting with what we can know, not going off of speculation or historiography to try and come to conclusions. And so thanks so much for joining us. Let's do this again and continue the series. The next one will be on the Table of Nations, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say on that.
Okay, looking forward to it.
Never forget, ladies and gentlemen, we are MythVision.